Book 3, The Cursed Papacy, 1512 to 1513. Chapter 11, The Confession of the Dying Pope. Job 1 verse 21. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The final truth. As a day overflows with life and joy, at the end of his days came a moment never imagined. On his deathbed, Pope Calixtus III resembled an island of corrupted silk and decaying holiness, adrift like a lonely, anguished castaway, lost in an ocean of Vatican marble and gold, which, beyond its impunity and ineffable duality, trembled before the inexorable judgment and the rigor of those who, by just aversion, perished under the cold edge of judge and executioner. Ciertamente, todo quanto lo rodaba reluce con la eternidad que solo el poder material puede otorgar, mas no el conocimiento en la sabiduría suprema de lo infinito e inmortal, salvo el, porque olia historia parada, como un heraldo del mal sepulcral que conleva el asedio final. And those imposing Gothic stained glass windows that adorned the papal chambers remained closed, like eyelids refusing to behold the cruel world outside. For within lies the true eternal self, the gateway to both the inner and outer worlds. Yet still, the last rays of the setting sun filtered through the folds of the delicate fabric, casting blood-tinged patterns that slowly spread across the floor's mosaics like translucent worms of timid light, still faintly incandescent. Once again, on the deathbed of Pope Calixtus III, that forsaken body and condemned soul were already an island of silk and rotting holiness amidst Vatican luxury, a sacred modesty of saints long past, where cries of supplication and clamoring could still be heard from the secret depths of reality, and from those who, out of steadfast conviction, bowed before his dignity and endurance. Lucius, now a 13-year-old boy with eyes that had glimpsed the abysses of the human soul, stood motionless beside the bed. He watched with a fixed, unsettling curiosity as the poison, undoubtedly poison, not any human or divine illness, spread with certainty and speed, working methodically through the body of the Holy Pontiff. The blackened blotches spread like archipelagos of corruption beneath the old man's translucent skin, the bluish tint on his thin lips, which had once pronounced blessings and condemnations with unshakable conviction, and the yellowed nails clutching the golden crucifix as if it could save him from what was to come. "Have you summoned me to receive your papal blessing, your holiness?" asked Lucius, his voice strikingly perceptive in that oppressive chamber. Yet there was no irony in his words, only a curiosity more real than usual, genuine in its quiet intensity. Calixtus III turned his head with effort upon the satin pillows. His eyes, yellowed like ancient parchment, fixed themselves on the boy with a flickering intensity that stood in stark contrast to his evident state of neglect, decay, and weary indifference. "Blessings are for the children of God," replied the Pope, each word a worn sigh, spoken more from the other side than from the one where the living heard, understood, and were subjected to the paltry command of the magnanimous, and more still, it smelled of rotting flesh. "And you, little prophet, were never that." A spasm of pain tore a grotesque grimace from him, but also one born of fear, confusion, and terror. "But neither are you a child of the devil. You are something other." Suddenly, a fit of coughing shook his frail body, that body abandoned to the condemnation of its own sentence. When he drew the silk cloth away from his still warm lips, the fabric showed a thick black stain spreading like ink in water. Metatron, standing by the door like a spectre with his bandages freshly changed, made the sign of the cross with trembling fingers, yet firm in his convictions. "Your Holiness, the child does not need to hear these." "Silence, cursed traitor!" the Pope interrupted with a sudden force that made all those present recoil. "For 11 years I have kept this secret. 11 years of far more than pious lies and slow poison in my cup." Without more or less, a skeletal hand rose to point at the cardinals and physicians swarming like vultures around the bed. "Everyone out. Today only truth speaks." When the heavy oak door closed with a sound that sealed everything, the atmosphere in the chamber changed. Though the air grew somewhat denser, what they perceived was darker still, like the instant before a storm that destroys and condemns at once. Then Calixtus pointed with a trembling finger toward an ebony coffer that seemed to stand in perpetual confession in the farthest corner of the holy chamber. There, the box, carved with scenes of the final judgment, absorbed the scant light that managed to cut through the dark affliction of the mortal holy pontiff, as if even the illness, without judgment or divine mercy, were reflected in it, in him, and in all those who had wished to be present at that final moment. "Open it," ordered the wretched dying man. Lucius approached the coffer with tentatively measured steps. As he knelt before it, he noticed the wood was unnaturally cold to the touch, as if it had been stored in ice rather than in the papal chambers. The locking mechanism was a complex piece of silver, engraved with inscriptions in a language that evoked a faithful reminiscence of the highest theurgy. Inside, upon a cushion of black velvet that seemed fashioned from an almost tangible darkness, lay a rolled parchment sealed with wax of the blackest color Lucius had ever seen. It was not merely dark, but the very absence of light and of every conceivable earthly form. When he touched it, an electric shiver ran along his arms to his shoulders, his hands, and his feet. The wax did not yield to the warmth of his fingers, and the parchment vibrated faintly, as if it contained something living and throbbing that clung to the last vestige of the material world. "Read," ordered the Pope, his voice now barely a whisper. "Read aloud what no living man, except this sinner who lies before you, has had the courage to utter." Lucius broke the seal with a precise, compromising motion. The parchment unfurled with a whisper that sounded like a prolonged moan, too human to come from an inanimate object. The words were written in a dark ink that smelled of copper and sulfur, but it was the signature at the end that made his pulse quicken, his eyes flare, and his expression change. Isadora de Lunae, Mother of the Void. In the year of our Lord 1486, Lucius began to read, as the torches flickered violently though there was no draught. "I, Isadora de Lunae, daughter of Isaac the Wise and mother of that which must not be named, do make this pact with the man who calls himself Pope." The document detailed a perverse and malevolent agreement, drafted in the language of legal statute and noble honor. In exchange for a male heir who would strengthen the papal lineage and purge the corruption of the Church, Isadora would invoke certain ancient forces that preceded the God of Abraham. But there was a clause, written in smaller letters that seemed to move when Lucius glanced at them out of the corner of his eye, which the Pope had overlooked in his ambition. "The fruit of this pact shall be neither human nor divine, but a living mirror, for it will show the Church not what it claims to be, but what it has chosen to become. And when the day of judgment comes, he will decide." Lucius lifted his gaze from the parchment, his stigmata throbbing with pain. "What am I?" Calixtus tried to sit up, his bones creaking beneath the skin in a futile attempt to prolong his final earthly affliction, but he failed and fell back onto the cushions with a groan that turned into a stifled shriek. "You are the mistake of an old and ambitious man," he confessed, black tears tracing his cheeks like rivers of aged ink. "I believed you to be an instrument, a divine weapon to purge my enemies." Consequently, a bitter laugh shook his chest. "But you are the judgment I so often preached from my gilded pulpits, and which now must be given its due." "The cardinals have assembled the Swiss Guard," he reported, his voice grave. "They are coming for the child." Borgia leads the group. Calixtus made a convulsive gesture toward Lucius, his fingers like claws opening and closing in the air. "Come closer," he urged, his voice now charged with a feverish urgency. When Lucius was within his reach, the Pope seized his wrist with surprising strength. His skin was cold and damp, like that of a fish just pulled from the water. That breath smelled of an open grave and sour wine. "I killed your mother the night you were born," confessed the alleged wrongdoer, his words this time splattered with that black liquid that was now his blood. "I strangled her with these very hands while you screamed in the adjoining room." Then his eyes filled with a retrospective terror, almost ritual in its contemplation. Then she laughed, "Lucius." It was then that her laughter reflected the infamy and sarcasm of a soul screaming to live. Yet life seemed to abandon her, though her last wretched words were, "He will come for you, and he will bear your name as his first victim." The pounding on the door began then, at first discreet, as if those on the other side were waiting for an invitation. Then it grew more insistent, until the entire structure trembled under the impact of what was undoubtedly an improvised battering ram. Metatron shoved a heavy chest in front of the entrance, but his expression made it clear they were only buying minutes. "Why confess it to me now?" Lucius asked, feeling his stigmata burn as never before, the blood flowing from them black and thick like that spilling from the Pope's mouth. Calixtus smiled, revealing teeth stained black. "Because I saw my reflection in the black mirror, lovely little mirror. I saw what awaits me on the other side." A shiver ran through his body from head to toe. "And I prefer the hell I know to the one that will come when you decide my punishment." The first axe blow rang out against the oak door, sending splinters flying with red and golden sparks from the religious carvings. Metatron ran toward Lucius, but the child did not move from his place. His gaze was fixed on the dying Pope, his eyes black as bottomless wells where there was only emptiness, weariness, cold, and shadow. "Tell me the final truth," Lucius demanded, and his voice carried a supernatural echo that made the stained glass, the walls, and the dissonant bells vibrate, their sound lurking in every corner, rampant in the dark shadow. "Who am I?" Pope Calixtus III, the 268th successor of St. Peter, looked upon the child he had helped create and, for the first time in his long existence of fermented sins exposed to the light of cruel divine and human repudiation, came to know true fear. "You are what answered when we called upon God," he whispered, his voice fading. And he did not answer. The door gave way with a crash that echoed through the corridors of the Vatican. But when the Swiss guards burst into the chamber, swords in hand and faces slick with sweat beneath their helms, they found a scene that left them paralyzed. Stealthy in its end and no longer captive, the Pope lay dead, his eyes wide open and his mouth frozen in a final silent scream meant for the living, yet fully perceptible in an immortal state, stripped of any worldly body. However, Metatron was kneeling beside the bed, praying in a tongue that made the ears of those who heard it in this earthly world bleed. And Lucius, standing by the now open window, gazed upon the city of Rome, which would soon be his, as Isadora's parchment burned in his hands with blue flames that did not consume the paper, but instead made the words glow with sacred intensity and vestiges of the arcane. "I, Lucius Primus, absolve you all." Consequently, the blue smoke rose toward the immaculate twilight sky. And somewhere beneath the streets of Rome, the waters of the Tiber began to flow black as the ink of a pen in the spectral night, carrying with them secrets that could no longer be steered toward a better fate. Posthumous revenge. A judgment pronounced and sentenced, for no one escapes time or death. Yet the one who watches is a faithful witness to the futility and vanity of persisting in profane desires, instead of having allowed themselves to be guided and seen by those recesses where the soul still lingers. Now, that final reflection, like the beats and breath of condemnation, without the prelude of any poetic chant, faded, leaving nothing but the corpse of Pope Calixtus III, still warm, when the pandemonium and chaos began. Lucius remained by the open window, watching the blue smoke of the burned parchment mingle with the first mists of the Roman dusk. Behind him, the Swiss guards hesitated, their swords raised in alert, yet daring not to advance toward the child who now held the ashes of the mystical document in his bleeding, almost purifying palms. Then Cardinal Borgia was the first to break the spell of horror that had paralyzed those present. "Arrest the monk and the child," he ordered, wiping the sweat that ran down his forehead with a cloth. "By mandate of the Sacred College of Cardinals and in the name of the honor of the Holy Church, Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman." Metatron rose with deliberate slowness, and his bandages began to darken with that shadowy liquid that visited him at every crossroads, a restless substance that not only unsettled him, but ignited within him an exultation that both tempted and confronted him. "By what authority, Rodrigo?" he asked with studied calm. "The Pope has named no successor, and his body has not yet grown cold." Borgia smiled, revealing a mockery tinged with audacity. "With the authority of the living over the dead." He gestured to the guards. "The child comes with me. The monk, to the dungeon." Lucius slowly turned toward the scene, his black eyes reflecting the torches around him in a disturbing way, like flames revealing the stains of sin upon his soul. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone not entirely human, but of a beast unknown to mankind. Calixtus signed an order before he died. He extended his left hand, where the ashes of the parchment had formed strange geometric shapes. The last signature of a dying pope. Borgia visibly paled. Everyone in the chamber knew what a papal order signed in articulo mortis meant. It was considered infallible and irrevocable, even for the next pontiff in line. "What have you done, little demon?" whispered the cardinal, advancing with uncertain steps. Then, the answer came from where it was least expected. Calixtus III's body jerked upright in the bed, his mouth open in a final, impossible gasp. When he spoke, the voice was no longer his own, but that of a woman, deep and ancient, marked by an unmistakable Hebrew accent. Death sentence for Isadora de Lunae, to be carried out this instant. Then the corpse fell backward, this time truly inert. A sepulchral silence filled the chamber, which suddenly seemed empty of every breath. Lucius fixed his gaze on Borgia, and in that instant the cardinal understood the true nature of posthumous revenge, not the one carried out in immediate wrath, but the one forged with rancor and hatred, until it becomes eternal damnation. "She is already dead," muttered Borgia, more to himself than to anyone else. "Yes," Lucius nodded with ritual slowness. "But now she has been officially condemned by the very church that killed her. Her name will forever be inscribed in posterity as that of a heretic and a witch whom no one shall remember." Metatron made the sign of the cross, not in reverence, but as protection against what was coming. "This is not about the past," the monk explained in a hoarse voice. "It is about the future. No pope will now be able to rectify his memory. His name will remain forever tarnished in the books of the church, as well as in the chapters of this short and sorrowful story." "And what does that matter now?" he retorted. "The witch rots in some grave, with no mourners and no name." But Lucius smiled, and that smile startled everyone present. "Names have power, Your Eminence. And now the church has put hers in writing, binding her to me forever." Outside, in the eternal city, a cold, rarefied wind began to blow, one that was in no way natural. The waters of the Tiber as well, once again black as ink, began to churn with waves that obeyed neither the current nor any natural force. Without even realizing it, for his limited vision of what he truly saw prevented him from looking beyond his own consequences. In that moment, Borgia made his first mistake, one that would not spare him from its dire repercussions. "Take the child away. To the dungeon of the Holy Office," he ordered in a shrill voice. The guards advanced, but at the first contact with Lucius, something extraordinary happened. The youngest soldier, a boy from the Swiss cantons who barely spoke Latin, fell to his knees, screaming in his native dialect. "I see their sins," Metatron translated in a somber voice. "I see them all." It was precisely then that Lucius placed his blood-stained hand upon the guard's head. "It is not their sins that he sees," he corrected. "They are yours, Rodrigo." For sins, as well as the reasonings that derive from them, are in essence the consequence of both ignorance and intelligence, since from the latter depends the development of human free thought. However, an intelligence that places its thoughts and knowledge at the service of purely individual ends is no less harmful. This is no less human than the capacity to erect ideologies and their prerogatives, which arise from induced circumstances, from the cultivation of experience, and from processes that only the human can conceive as engendering. The effect was immediate. Borgia staggered backward as if struck by a mystical, overflowing fury, while visions of his most atrocious crimes, the disappeared children, the violated nuns, the administered poisons, manifested before the eyes of all present, projected through the poor Swiss guard, who now wept and fled like a child hounded by the ancestral nightmares of his own soul's voice. "Enough!" Borgia shouted, his voice fractured by panic. "This is witchcraft. Lucius stepped forward, and each of his steps echoed like a relentless hammer blow in the silence of the chamber. No. This is justice. The same one Calixtus signed with his final breath. With absolute certainty, Borgia's second mistake was trying to flee. Just as he turned his back, he stumbled over the ebony coffer that contained the original parchment. The lid flew open, revealing that it was not empty, as everyone had assumed. Inside, set into the black velvet lining, lay a small silver dagger with the papal seal engraved on its hilt. The fisherman's dagger, Metatron whispered. With it, papal sentences in articulo mortis were carried out. Lucius took the weapon with devotion and reverence. He made no gesture against Borgia, he simply held the dagger before his own eyes. Isadora de Lunae, condemned for heresy, he formally declared. May her name be erased from the face of the earth, her works burned, and her memory cursed for all eternity. At that very instant, in the convent of Santa Maria del Lanto, the empty cells began to fill with a black smoke that smelled of sulfur and long-fermented myrrh. The nuns ran toward the garden, where the black roses had begun to sing in a tongue forgotten even by the ancestral patriarchs. And within the cloistered Vatican, Borgia understood Calixtus's game of power far too late. Beyond what appearances reflected, the true battle was being waged within the man himself, enslaved and poisoned by passions and delusions granted to him as both gifts and curses alike. Yet the true meaning of his mortal condemnation still remained unknown to him. No, he gasped, collapsing to his knees upon the luxurious floor covering. It cannot be. Immediately, Lucius bowed his head. Oh, but it is. The sentence was not for Isadora in the past. The dagger gleamed with a light of its own. It was for the Isadora who returns. Certainly, Borgia's third mistake was his last. As he tried to snatch the dagger from Lucius, his hand passed straight through the child, as if he were made of smoke. In that precise instant of contact, all those present saw the truth. Lucius was not entirely in the room. A part of him, the essential part, the ethereal one, was elsewhere, in another time, watching from the future while events intervened in the present of the past. Metatron was the first to understand. The judgment has already taken place, he murmured. And we are nothing more than echoes of the past, like the light of stars that reaches the earth after millennia. Amid rage and impotence, Borgia went mad. With a tearing scream, he drew his own dagger and plunged it into the chest of the Swiss guard, who still remained kneeling. I will not be a plaything of witches and demon-possessed children. But the blood that flowed was not naturally red, but black as ink at midnight, and as it touched the floor, it formed words in Aramaic. Judgment comes. The sentence is already written. Then Lucius let the papal dagger fall, and it drove itself straight into the marble floor without anyone touching it, vibrating like a living thing. Calixtus thought he would condemn my mother to oblivion, the child explained, as his form began to fade little by little. But he only ensured that her name could never be profaned, much less erased. When the guards finally dared to advance, their hands passed through Lucius as if he were a spectre of the past made present through its effect and its illusion. Metatron, finally grasping the cosmic game, knelt before the bed of the dead Pope, silently bearing the weight of his own inner conflict. Your Holiness, he whispered with bitter irony. In the end, you were Isadora's greatest ally. Outside, the wind carried the blue smoke of the burned parchment toward the Tiber, where the black waters received it like an ancient, familiar friend. And somewhere between time and eternity, a woman with ember-bright eyes and hair black as night opened her arms to receive her long-awaited vindication. For better or for worse, the Church had condemned Isadora de Lunae for her heresy and her misfortune. And in doing so, it had rendered her practically immortal. Chapter 12, The Conclave of the Damned. Ezekiel 37 verses 1-4. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of a valley, and it was full of bones. and he caused me to pass by them all around, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and indeed they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? So I answered, O Lord God, you know. Then he said to me, Prophesy over these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. The bones speak. Each day buried the one before it, yet in the Vatican almost everything seemed unchanged. That familiar scent endured, of incense and fear. Barely 3 days had passed since the death of Calixtus III, and the Sistine Chapel, that sacred enclosure where the cardinals chose the new pope, had become a gilded trap for the men who now trembled behind its walls, like rodents crawling through the filthy, dark sores of the Vatican. However, like a feline stalking its prey, Lucius watched from the shadows of the upper choir, invisible to the scarlet-robed men gathered below. Metatron stood beside him as well, his bandages soaked with a black liquid that dripped slowly onto the marble tiles, bearing the very consistency of a condemnation not divine, but earthly. We shouldn't be here, whispered the monk, though his voice sounded more weary than worried. This is sacrilege. Lucius did not answer at once. His eyes, reflecting Michelangelo's frescoes as though they were windows into another world, followed the movements of the cardinals with measured attention. At the far end, Borgia, pale and sweating despite the unusual chill that ruled the chapel, argued in hushed tones with Della Rovere near the altar, while the other scarlet-clad prelates formed shifting clusters around them, like silver fish gliding through the depths of an aquarium that was at once sacred and profane. Listen, Lucius said at last, leaning forward. At first, Metatron heard nothing out of the ordinary. After a moment, very gradually, the sound became perceptible, a dull cracking that rose from beneath the floor, as if something enormous were stirring in the catacombs under their feet. That murmur swelled into an unmistakable rumble, poised between clamor and convulsion. The bones of the former popes, Lucius explained. They are speaking. Below, the cardinals had begun to notice it. The elderly Cardinal Orsini struck the floor with his ceremonial staff. Silence! He ordered, but his voice trembled. We are here to choose Peter's successor, not to listen to trifles, heresies, or superstitions. An especially violent crack seemed to answer him, making the golden chalices upon the neglected altar tremble. Along the walls, the frescoes of the Last Judgment appeared to stir, the painted figures twisting within their frames of plaster as though restless beneath centuries of silence. Borgia was the first to shatter protocol. He ran toward the door, only to find it locked from the outside. His fists pounded against the wood, the blows echoing like gunshots in the hollowed hush of the consecrated chamber. Open! In the name of God, open this door! Suddenly, a low laugh answered from the depths. It was not human, yet neither was it wholly demonic. It was the sound of stone grinding against stone, of centuries of dust being disturbed by something that had remained asleep for far too long, or perhaps merely waiting in patient dormancy. Then Lucius rose with force, and for the first time, the cardinals saw him. The 13-year-old boy now wore a simple white tunic, and his hands, still bandaged, revealed how the stigmata continued to weep with fervor and persistence, responding to the silent call of a candle without flame or wick. Wherever he stepped, the marble tiles revealed brief flashes of horrific scenes, popes devoured by worms, cardinals hanging from their own vestments, like prey trapped by their ambition and greed. Outside, the basilica barely rose above the horizon, engulfed in flames beneath a setting full moon. You cannot choose, Lucius announced, his voice amplified and thickened by torment and unnatural density. Not until you hear what the dead have to say. Della Rovere, always the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, of the cardinals, stepped forward, fists clenched. This is blasphemy! Out of here, you cursed, demon-possessed child! Without warning, the floor beneath his feet split open. Not by much, just a few centimeters, but enough for a skeletal hand to emerge and clutch his ankle. The bones were blackened, as if charred, and on each phalanx, inscriptions in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew glowed with a timid warmth. Pope John XII, Lucius identified as Della Rovere screamed and struggled to free himself. The one who sold the sacraments for gold coins. Ask him what he thinks of your ambition, Giuliano. More hands emerged now, dozens of them, each belonging to a deceased pontiff. Some, like the one gripping Della Rovere, were complete skeletons. Others, the more recent, retained shreds of mummified flesh. All crawled toward the living cardinals, whose screams now filled the chapel. Borgia, cornered against the altar, drew forth an immaculate gold crucifix, still gleaming as if it had never known devotion or sin. "Step back, impure spirits! In the name of Christ!" Then, suddenly, a hand interrupted him. It seemed to belong to Boniface VIII, for the skeleton, still clad in the tattered remnants of his pontifical cassock, snatched the crucifix from him with unsettling ease and threw it at Lucius' feet. "They do not obey Christ," the child explained, as Boniface's skeleton pointed accusatorily at Borgia, keeping its gaze fixed on him, innocent yet inquisitorial. "They obeyed the same thing as you, power. And now they have come to collect the debt they left unpaid." The chaos that followed was indescribable. Like rats fleeing the sewers, the cardinals ran in circles, pursued by the remnants of their own predecessors. The elderly Orsini fell to his knees as the skeleton of Paul II approached him, its bones still adorned with stolen jewels that ground against the sacred marble like heavy teeth. "I cannot!" Orsini screamed, crying like a small child. "I cannot bear their infernal voices!" From the heights of the choir, Metatron watched the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination, as if before his eyes did not unfold profane chaos, but a solemn judgment that, once pronounced, found in its consummation a twisted form of repose. "What are the dead telling them?" he asked Lucius. "The truth. The same one I have been writing in blood all this time." Below, Borgia had been cornered by 3 papal skeletons. One of them, identifiable by the tiara still perched atop its yellowed skull, pointed toward the altar with an index bone that glowed with prophetic inscriptions. "No!" Borgia screamed, but it was too late. "Look," Lucius commanded from above, his voice resounding with an authority at once distant and almost indulgent, for within the logics of the Vatican, a pope and a condemned man differ neither in salvation nor in punishment, but only in the measure of their harm and injury. Thus on earth, only light escapes, transmuted into the spirit of the stars, and attains its absolute perfection within this incomprehensible creation. Such a voice admitted neither reply nor disobedience from the Son of Man. Then the smoke thickened into fine amorphous masses that fell under their own weight and abomination, shaping images within the tainted air of that cursed place. Rome appeared, but not the Rome they knew. This was a city in flames, where statues of kings, popes, and emperors were dragged down by frenzied multitudes stripped of spiritual direction, seized by a chaos born from the contradictions of their own reality. By then, the collapse of their principles, of their order and moral judgment, so long manipulated and absorbed into a fractured design between man and nature, had reached a point beyond return, beyond any hope of redemption. Once the mortal judgment had been pronounced, St. Peter's Basilica lay plundered. And in the midst of the chaos stood a tall, imposing, slender figure, a black tiara crowning its head, ruling from a throne fashioned from the bones of heretics, as though upon them rested, indelible and unyielding, the pillars of its dominion. "The future," Della Rovere whispered, now freed from the skeletal grip, yet too terrified to move. "Our future." The skeletons nodded in unison, a dreadful motion that set centuries-old vertebrae grinding against the dust of oblivion. Then, one by one, they began to point at Lucius. The message, unmistakable and cold as chiseled stone, needed no interpreter. Consequently, Borgia was the first to understand. Then, with a laugh fraying at the edges of hysteria, he rose and pointed at the boy. "It is him. He is the one we must choose." With predatory swiftness, a wave of murmurs swept through the chapel. The cardinals, still trembling from the touch of the dead, turned their eyes toward Lucius with a mixture of terror and a hope poorly concealed beneath their vestments and the roles they bore as high priests and princes of the church. It cannot be, Della Rovere protested. He is a child. A bastard without tradition or lineage. It was at that moment that the skeleton of Boniface VIII approached Della Rovere and, with a gesture that under other circumstances might have seemed almost tender, stroked his cheek with its cold phalanges. Then, with sudden force, it drove its bony thumb straight into his left eye. Suddenly, Della Rovere's scream fused with the sound of Lucius' bones cracking as the boy, now standing at the center of the chaos, whether vision or reality, began to grow. Not by much, only enough to seem a young man of 18, in the full vigor of body and spirit, no longer the figure of frailty and immaturity his enemies had so easily dismissed. His stigmata bled freely now, pooling at his feet, where Enochian letters shimmered and writhed like living glyphs in a restless crimson tide. "You do not choose me for my holiness," Lucius said, his voice now that of a young man. "You choose me out of fear. Fear of what I have shown you. Fear of what I was, what I am, and what I will be." Then Metatron descended swiftly from the upper choir, his bandages leaving a black trail along the steps that barely emerged from the gloom. When he reached the main floor, he knelt before Lucius in sacred exaltation and devotion. "And yet," he said aloud, so that all might hear, "it is the only possible choice for a being who has abandoned his judgment and his conviction." The papal skeletons nodded in a sacred mortal affliction. Then, one by one, they began to descend once more into the depths of the catacombs, where only the remains of those who had once been men found peace and rest, whether in heaven or in hell, where eternal condemnation was dispensed without distinction or appeal. Only Boniface VIII remained long enough to place his bony hand upon Lucius' head in a grotesque final blessing. His jaw moved, and though no audible sound emerged, all within the chapel heard the words that pressed themselves upon the unpunished silence that bore witness. "We choose the one who had already been marked by destiny." Then, with a final crack, he vanished beneath the tiles, reduced to dust and to the dense residue of the surrounding malignancy, leaving behind only a small mound of black powder where he had stood, as though he had been waiting for eternal life all along. The provisional silence that followed was so absolute that one could hear the steady drip of candle wax falling onto the marble. Until Borgia, ever the politician even at the edge of the abyss, knelt with a smile warped by fear and dread. "Habemus papum," he announced, and his voice rang out like the croak of a diseased crow, ragged and formless in the hollowed air. The other cardinals, slowly, followed his example, all except Della Rovere, who lay upon the floor with his hands pressed to his bleeding eye, muttering curses in Greek and Latin. Lucius looked at each of them in turn, and in his black eyes, unshielded by shame or fear, they saw the reflection of their own destiny. "This is not an election," he said at last. "It is a reckoning long overdue." Far outside, in the streets of what remained of Rome, the bells began to toll of their own accord. And in the Tiber, whose black waters now flowed toward the nether sea, something vast and ancient stirred beneath the surface, like a being only beginning to make itself known, awakening from a long hibernal sleep or from a sacred, divine torpor, where the devil holds direct sway in a game that, to humankind, appears not as destiny, but as chance. The forced election. The air in the Sistine Chapel had grown thicker and more macabre than usual, like the oil that anoints and grants essence, yet laden with the scent of melted wax and human fear. Lucius, now transformed into a young man of 18 by some arcane and unknown power, misunderstood and even less comprehended, stood before the altar where, minutes earlier, the skeletons of deceased popes had pronounced their manifest will. His stigmata, now stretching from his palms to his forearms, oozed a thick black substance that dripped onto the mosaic floor, tracing strange geometric furrows as it spread. Cardinal Borgia was the first to fracture the sepulchral silence that pressed upon them. With forced elegance, he knelt before Lucius, his crimson vestments pooling around his knees like a spill of ceremonial blood. "The Holy Spirit has spoken through the holy pontiffs now departed," he declared, his voice carefully tempered and modulated to conceal the terror that made his hands and feet tremble beneath his vestments. "The choice is evident." Della Rovere, still writhing on the floor with his ruined eye, could muster little more than a guttural growl of pain and rage at such an outrage and helplessness. "This is no election, it is heresy." No council can. A blast of icy wind, born from nowhere, sliced his words in half. The candle flames froze in midair, suspended as sculptures of bluish ice that refracted infinite images of Lucius crowned with the papal tiara, each reflection a sovereign apparition trapped in crystal fire. Metatron, who had remained in a corner observing everything with his expressionless and contemplative eyes, advanced slowly toward the center of the chapel. His bandages, now completely soaked with that black liquid that clung to him with relentless persistence, left sticky traces across the marble, his gait weary and yet filled with a quiet, dreadful resolve. "It is not heresy," he corrected, his voice ringing like a bronze clapper struck within a hollow tower. "It is prophecy, written in the bones of the dead long before this child was born." Consequently, Lucius raised a hand, and the cardinals held their breath, bearing witness to their own faithful disquiet and confusion. Wherever he pointed, Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment began to move, not in uncertainty, but in a kind of sacred reckoning. The painted figures twisted within their frames, mouths open in silent cries, while they indicated each scarlet-robed prelate with iron severity, without rancour, yet with a memory that remembers and confines, stripped of pity and shame. "Look well, but not upon your brother's sin, rather upon the beam lodged in your own eye," Lucius commanded, his voice no longer wholly human, as if threaded with distant thunder. "Look at the future you have built with your lies and ambitions." Then the central fresco, that of Christ the Judge and Redeemer, tore itself free from the wall and floated forward, untroubled, as if such defiance of stone were the most natural gesture in creation. It drifted into the presbytery, vast and luminous. The image had changed beyond dispute. The face of the judge was now Lucius. And at his feet, instead of souls ascending or descending, there were cardinals devoured without distinction by mythic creatures with diabolic visages and harpy claws, their scarlet robes shredded like banners after a failed crusade. Then Borgia staggered backward, tripping over his own Mazzetta. What devilry is this?" "It is no devil," Lucius replied, as the animated fresco began to burn with black flames curling around its edges like ink set alight. "It is simply what comes. What you have brought upon yourselves and upon those who render you obedience, silence, and submission." A sound rumbled from the depths of the Vatican, or perhaps from hell itself. It was not the cracking of bones this time, but something more visceral, more organic, yet equally prophetic and malevolent. As if the very entrails of the earth had whispered the tangle of a nameless condemnation, for the road is filled with good deeds that lead directly to hell. Generations, through the acceptance of this collective madness, were lost in chaos and in the senselessness that presumed them turned into what they most feared to be, some resigned, others condemned heretics. "The Tiber," Metatron whispered. "The black waters are arriving." Then the cardinals gathered together like sheep before the storm, their fine vestments soaked with sweat. Only Della Rovere retained some measure of his arrogance and defiance, though his one healthy eye could not conceal the terror consuming him from within. "What do you want from us?" he asked in a broken voice. Lucius smiled, and in that instant they all saw the cynicism disguised as eloquence that his teeth and gestures revealed as sacramental evidence within the delirious unfolding, not of the future, but of the present, both in their bodies and in their minds. "What you have always wanted to give me. The throne of Peter." Suddenly, a violent crash shook the chapel. From the ceiling, where Michelangelo had painted the creation of Adam, fragments of plaster and paint began to fall everywhere. Yet when they struck the floor, they did not shatter. Instead, they transformed into small crawling beings, humanoid figures made of painted matter, slithering toward the cardinals with perverse and insidious intent. "Enough!" Borgia shouted, falling to his knees. "We choose you. By all the saints, we choose you." The other cardinals followed his example, one after another, until only Della Rovere remained standing, trembling yet obstinate, not even pausing to consider the evil already unleashed that would terrify and condemn them. Lucius approached him with movements almost spiritual, stealthy like those of a feline. When he spoke, his voice was soft, yet sharp as the edge of a dagger whose sole purpose was to pierce and remain relentless in itself. You more than anyone, Giuliano. You who always coveted this throne for yourself. I would rather die, Della Rovere spat, though his voice trembled with a trace of doubt that slipped into his words, despite the apparent certainty he had shown in his thinking and actions. Oh, you will die, Lucius promised. But not today. With an almost affectionate gesture, Lucius touched the wound in Della Rovere's eye. When he withdrew his finger, the blood dripping from the injury had changed from bright red to thick black, and as it fell to the floor it formed words, primus inter pares. You will be my right hand, Lucius declared. The first among equals. And each day, this mark will remind you of the price of disobedience. It was then that Della Rovere fell to his knees, not out of submission, but because his legs could no longer support him. The sound of the raging Tiber was now audible even within the chapel, despite the thick walls of marble, basalt, and tufa that sealed it off from the outside world. Metatron approached Lucius and whispered something in his ear, something that made the young man smile with complete and satisfied complacency. The moment is now, Lucius announced. The white smoke must rise. Borgia, ever the opportunist, was the first to reach for the rope that would ring the bells of St. Peter's. But when he pulled it, a jet of black water burst from the mechanism, drenching him from head to toe. It is everywhere, he shouted, spitting out the bitter liquid that now filled his morbid body. On the other side, Lucius walked toward the chimney where the voting ballots were traditionally burned. Without the need for matches or tinder, he extended his bleeding hands over the cold hearth. Then the flames that rose were neither red nor golden, but a blinding white that did not merely illuminate, but made the eyes weep. Look closely, princes of the church, he said as the white smoke began to rise through the chimney toward the Roman sky. This is the final act of your prolonged farce. Outside, in the colonnades of St. Peter's Square, the crowd awaiting the outcome of the conclave began to shout and grow restless when, suddenly, white smoke emerged. Yet their joy shifted into deeper confusion when the smoke, instead of dispersing, formed clear letters against the immeasurable twilight sky. LVCIVR Prims. And as the name of the new pope wrote itself across Rome, proclaiming him absolute sovereign of the divine and the earthly, the waters of the Tiber burst their banks and flooded the lower streets of the city. Yet it was not water they carried, but something viscous and alive that writhed among the black waves, a presence with too many teeth and eyes that gleamed with a golden and ominously familiar glow. Inside the chapel, Lucius leaned over the prostrate cardinals. His silhouette now stretched across the wall like that of a much taller man, more gaunt, yet also muscular and powerfully built. Rise, he commanded. We have a mass to celebrate. And thus, beneath the gaze of the animated frescoes and the rumble of the black waters striking the doors of the Vatican, the darkest conclave in history came to its end. The truth was that no one dared to ask what kind of mass would be celebrated. Yet all of them knew the only possible answer, for that secret already lingered faintly upon their lips and in their expressions, and they tried to conceal it with more than diligence and resolve. Whatever it might be, it would mark the beginning of a certain end. And the end of the beginning they believed they had secured. Chapter 13, The Coronation of the Lamb. Revelation 6 verses 12 to 13. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. And the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its unripe figs when shaken by a strong wind. The signs of heaven. The dawn of the day of the coronation did not arrive, defying the scorn, the prophesies, and the designs that intertwined within certain patient murmurs. It was no ordinary sunset, but an almost impossible eclipse, not foretold by any papal astronomer, sorcerer, or shaman, from whose knowledge they felt and lived. The same dread devoured the sun just as its first rays should have illuminated the imposing dome of St. Peter's, as on every other day. Yet the darkness that fell upon Rome was anything but natural, for it smelled of sulphur and sour wine, as did almost everything there. Moreover, those sacrilegious stenches drove the animals mad in their cages, suffering not a madness of instinct, but one of the devil, without fear or restraint. Lucius, now dressed in the white garments of the Pope-elect, watched from the private balcony as the city sank into the chaos of instinct, vandalism, ignominy, and bewilderment. At his side, Metatron adjusted the ermine mozzetta over the young pontiff's shoulders. His bandaged fingers left faint dark stains upon the immaculate white of the sumptuous garments. "You should not wear white yet," the monk murmured. "It is against tradition." Lucius smiled without joy, brimming with satisfaction. His eyes, now completely black, reflected the torches that were beginning to flare in the streets with mounting fervor. "My entire existence is against tradition, old friend." Suddenly, a thunderclap rolled in the distance, though there were no clouds in the sky. It seemed instead to rise from the depths of the earth, as if the Vatican itself were growling in anguish and pain. In the basilica, the preparations continued despite, or perhaps because of, the signs. The cardinals, pale and sweating beneath their red capes, formed a semicircle around the high altar. Borgia, charged with the grand liturgical ceremony, reviewed for the 10th time the ritual written in parchment and charcoal ink. "Where is Della Rovere?" he asked an acolyte, wiping his brow with a cloth already soaked. The young man trembled. In the Pauline Chapel, Your Eminence. He says he will not take part in this. Blasphemy, a voice finished behind him. Borgia turned to find Lucius watching him from the threshold. The young Pope-elect had not been announced. There were no trumpets, no bustle, no fanfare. He was simply there, as if he had materialized from the darkness itself. "Your Holiness," Borgia lied, bowing in a reverence that did little to conceal his terror. "We are ready for the procession." Lucius stepped forward, his bare feet, another breach of tradition, leaving black footprints on the newly polished marble. "There will be no procession," he declared. "No fanfare. No vainglory, no hymns, no statues." He touched the golden pectoral hanging from Borgia's neck, and the metal blackened at his touch. "Today the Church receives what it deserves. A spectacle of its fall in silence." Without warning, a choir of children's voices could be heard rising from some hidden recess of the basilica. Yet it was not the traditional Tu es Petrus they would normally intone at that hour. It was the Dies Irae once more, sweeping through the nave. But they were singing it in reverse. In the streets, the remnants of the crowd that had gathered to witness the coronation began to feel the weight of the supernatural enthroning itself within their very being. It was no surprise, then, that the statues of the saints in the main squares wept tears of blood, iron, and terror. The well spewed thick black water that fell without distinction of creed or fervor. And in the sky, where the eclipsed sun should have been, there now hovered something that made even the bravest cross themselves in fear and shame. "It is a lamb," an old woman murmured, pointing toward the sky with a trembling finger, as though naming it might cause it to retreat. And so it was. A somewhat nebulous figure in the shape of a lamb, yet of astonishing size, stretched across the entire Roman sky like a living mantle of mist and seeping light. Its wool seemed woven from dying stars. Its eyes, or rather, too many eyes, arranged in patterns that defied human proportion and symmetry, shone with a golden brilliance so intense it seemed the very hue that the aged gold of reliquaries had long sought to capture. The city fell silent. Not in reverence, but in terror before the helplessness of a debt with no chance of repayment. Inside the basilica, the air smelled of incense, candles, and rancid wine. The stained glass windows shattered one after another, but there was no crash. Each fragment of glass remained suspended, turning slowly like planets in a system obeying a new law of gravity, far from the adornment and subversion of the system before the knowledge it was building, but also distant from what was truly essential, for he who possesses material goods does not drift away through their acquisition, but through improper obsession. The sacred images, now broken, formed a path of crushed glass, guiding Lucius's steps as he walked toward the high altar with a calm that belonged to no citizen of the city nor of the region. In the heights of the dome, the painted cherub seemed to weep tears of fresh oil, almost in a gesture of reverence, but also of astonishment. "What are you?" whispered Borgia, unable to contain the question that burned his tongue like a prayer or a blasphemous curse. Lucius stopped just before reaching the papal throne. He knelt, and in his eyes there was a new radiance, as if something else were looking out from within him, not from the chamber with its passages, furniture, and sanctuaries, but from a place where human experience separated from the divine. "What you made me be," replied the arrogant, pretentious voice. And then, with a smile too confident for his mortal becoming, and with too many teeth showing on his face, he added, "Now, crown me," before he changes his mind. It was then that a muffled thunder rolled through the city. But it did not come from the sky. It came from within the Lamb. Just like the redemption of the human being, amid hardships one realizes, if one reflects on their error, and far from believing in a heaven painted in velvet, acts in accordance with the world of the great living and giving God, though at times reluctant. For he who begets a being capable of its own destruction is perplexed before the judgment that, by deed or omission, contemplates the only way in which salvation and damnation exist. And when the Lamb opened its mouth wide, no roar came out, nor song, nor any audible word. What emerged from it was not a sound, but the living omen of an end without beginning or end. The bells of Rome began to toll rhythms of chaos and death, although no one touched them. They were sounded by the supernatural power of good and evil. Each one did so with an echo in a different tongue, as if proclaiming the same uncompromising truth that governed all peoples at the same time and everywhere. For the truth was that they always said it would not come, but now it was here. The acceptance of destiny. The air in the basilica had grown thicker than usual, as if time itself resisted advancing toward the fatally inevitable. Right there, Lucius remained kneeling before the high altar, but his posture was not one of submission, rather a strange silent defiance that called for combat. The flames of the candles flanking the presbytery had frozen in the rarefied air, their orange tongues, too, transformed into grotesque sculptures of bloody glass, reflected the light in a somber and unnatural way. Cardinal Borgia, with his scrawny hands barely able to hold the weight of the papal tiara, approached with somewhat hesitant steps. Then, the gold of the triple crown gleamed with a stubborn brilliance, as if it were molten beneath its surface of fire and magma. "Your Holiness," murmured Borgia, his voice broken by a terror he could not conceal. "It is time." Lucius lifted his gaze, and in that moment, all those present saw the truth. His eyes were no longer human. Those pupils had expanded to cover the entire iris, black as the void between the stars, and within their depth flickered golden sparks that formed unknown constellations in a darkness and emptiness stranger than the place of his dwelling. "No," he pronounced in a voice that resonated in the bones of those listening, as if vibrating at a frequency beyond sound. "Do not place it on me yet." Behind the choir columns, Metatron held his breath as long as he could, though his bandages, soaked in the thick liquid that never ceased to flow from his stigmata, continued to macerate his macabre passage through this world, sticking to his skin with a wet sound that would not relent or cease. With the most cautious measures, he knew what was about to occur, for he had seen it in visions that woke him screaming night after night. Then, Lucius rose with an almost supernatural grace, but his bare feet left blackish marks on the polished marble. He advanced toward the main balcony, where the purple velvet curtains parted on their own before his presence. St. Peter's Square was immersed in a supernatural silence, and a barely exsanguine light illuminated from the shadows. Yet, thousands of faces looked upward, where the celestial lamb began to disintegrate in the cold and volatile atmosphere, like heavenly dew, its stellar wool falling like living ash upon the city, almost forgotten by pagan gods, which suffered its own history with delight, yet with equal despair and haste. Perhaps in redemption, though it obeyed a cause or an effect that man, in his ignorance, did not comprehend, yet, even so, that unfortunate event awaited not only damnation, but also chastisement. Upon a weak matter it had to find rest after so much suffering, not due to an external cause, but to its direct responsibility. "Look at me closely," Lucius commanded, and his voice multiplied, coming from every statue, every mosaic, every crack in the walls of the Vatican. "For what you see is not a pope." He paused, and in that moment of guilty silence, all heard the sound of their own hearts beating in an uneven rhythm. "It is a mirror." Behind him, the cardinals began to convulse. First it was Borgia, who fell to his knees, spitting white worms that twisted on the floor to form Latin words, Hippocrati, mendaces, furs. Then the others followed, a chorus of old men vomiting long-hidden truths. Lucius turned toward Peter's throne. With a movement too fast for the human eye to follow, he struck the centuries-old seat with his pastoral staff. The sacred would creak like old bones before shattering, yet the fragments did not fall to the ground. They remained suspended in the air, turning slowly around the new pope, like planets around a black sun that attracts, yet at the same time repels. "This is not my place," he declared, and in his words there was an echo of something ancient and terrible. "My kingdom." A sudden laugh burst from his lips, along with a sound that made the ears of the nearest acolytes bleed. "My kingdom has already arrived. And you yourselves have brought it." The deafening crash that followed did not come from outside, but from the basilica's stained glass windows, which shattered inward in a rain that seemed like liquid mercury. The tiny metallic droplets did not fall to the floor, but crawled across the mosaics and frescoes, forming ephemeral prophecies before dissolving into the vast universe. Suddenly, a teenage acolyte, with black tears running down his cheeks, crawled toward Lucius, the tiara trembling in his hands. "Your Holiness," he whispered, his voice broken by an ancestral fear. "The rite must be completed." Lucius took the papal crown. For a moment, which felt like an eternity, all those present saw how the rubies embedded in its base transformed into human eyes, their pupils dilated by primordial terror, yet with a hope that overflowed from their hearts. "No," he repeated, but this time his voice had an almost compassionate quality that chilled the blood more than any scream. "This is not a coronation." When he placed the tiara upon his head, the celestial lamb in the sky opened its mouth in a silent scream that shook the foundations of Rome, as well as those of all who had made their own empire within it. For when the unwary becomes aware of their yoke, they do not complain out of the shame of their own existence, but out of the cruelty of the plans and earthly condemnation to which their entire lineage and those other plebeians who were not chosen have been subjected. They complain not from guilt, but from the pain of realizing too late that their destiny was drawn without their consent, and that inherited submission became law before it could be questioned. "It is a sacrifice." The word still echoed in the air when all the bells of Rome rang in unison, like in a macabre prelude that did not make them tremble, but toll in disarray. Not in celebration, but in a lament that shook the soul of the city and, within it, all its inhabitants. Right on the high altar, the golden chalice containing the wine of consecration began to boil, with black bubbles bursting on its surface like sins confessed too late to even avoid their contemplation. Metatron, already hidden in the shadows, brought a bandaged hand to what remained of his mouth. "Too late," he murmured, and his words blended with the chant of the bones of past popes now resonating from the catacombs beneath the Vatican. "Too late for all." Meanwhile, in the depths of the secret archives, a forgotten scroll began to burn with cold flames that did not consume the paper, but revealed ominous words hidden centuries ago. Ecce vermis Dei. Behold the worm of God. Chapter 14, the first decree, the truth no one wanted to hear. Hebrews for verse 13. And there is no created thing that is not manifest in his presence. But all things are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. The open archives. The air in the Sala Regia smelled of melted wax and perpetuated fear. The now great Lucius I entered without an escort, dressed only in a plain white linen tunic, his bare feet left dark footprints on the marble. Behind him, for acolytes dragged a black iron chest whose hinges groaned like tormented souls. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Borgia stepped forward, his voice a tremor of false reverence. "Protocol requires that the documents be reviewed first by..." "By whom?" Lucius turned slowly. His eyes, now completely black, reflected the flames of the candles that burned without being consumed by the same ones who have buried these truths for centuries. What followed was as clear, yet as forceful, as the sharp strike of his pastoral staff against the floor, which made the hall resound. Then, the flames of the candelabra froze in the air, forming words in Enochian that floated above the heads of the cardinals, like an impious garland standing aghast before the great work of consummated evil. Today, Lucius announced as the chest opened on its own with a crack like breaking bones, the church will look upon its own face. What emerged from the chest were not soiled parchments, but lugubrious whispers, yet tormented. They were voices, yes. Hundreds of them, thousands, emerged like a swarm of spiritual insects, filling the hall with forbidden confessions, with secrets buried alive beneath the foundations of the Vatican. Simply, the cardinals fell to their knees, covering their ears, which bled, as the voices penetrated directly into their minds with brutality, yet with equal insistence. "Enough!" he shouted, but his mouth was suddenly sealed, his lips stitching themselves shut with threads of shadow. Lucius walked toward the main table, where the documents now unfolded on their own, the pages of human skin throbbing like hearts freshly torn from their tender womb. 1296, he read aloud as he ran a finger over a text written in almost dried blood. Boniface VIII orders the sacrifice of 300 children to consecrate the foundations of the new basilica. The walls sweated blood like wine distilled into the cask. Thick, dark drops traced the same verses upon the stones, the windows, and the cobblestones. "Lies!" Farnesio coughed, spitting out 3 teeth and a white worm that formed the word sin as it died. Lucius did not respond. He simply moved on to the next document without so much as flinching. 1423. The Council of Mirrors. Experiments with alchemy to recreate the body of Christ using the remains of. Without prior warning, at last a crash cut through his placid reading. Not by chance, the great tapestry behind the papal throne tore itself apart, revealing the mysterious black mirror of the catacombs, now the size of the entire wall, like a direct portal to the distinguished palace of hell. Even so, upon its smooth surface, each cardinal saw reflected not his present face, but the face from the exact moment in which he had sold his soul to the designs of the evil allotted to every man incarnated upon the earth. Borgia screamed when his reflection showed how he was poisoning his own father during the Paschal Supper. "This is the work of the devil," gasped a cardinal present, as his reflection strangled a monk in some dark confessional. At once, Lucius positioned himself between the cardinals and the mirror. "No," he corrected as the frozen flames began to drip wax that burned holes into the marble. "It is the work of truth. And today, Rome will drink it down to the dregs." Outside, in the square, the enraged crowd began to shout when the outer walls of the basilica somehow began to transpire the very same texts that Lucius was reading inside the chamber. Those words carved themselves into the stone as if invisible hands were chiseling them with pick and hammer. Inside, Farnesio collapsed without further warning, convulsing and losing what little strength he had left, while from his mouth burst a torrent of worms that formed his full confession as they writhed furiously upon the floor. Lucius observed the scene with eyes that now reflected the flames in reverse. First papal decree, he announced as the black mirror began to absorb what little light remained in the hall. As of today, no secret shall remain buried. No sin shall have forgiveness. No lie shall survive the sun. The crash that followed caused the portraits of previous popes to fall from the walls, as if the phenomenon were tied to an intimate memory. The gilded frames shattered upon striking the floor, and each canvas, for an instant, revealed the true face of the pontiff it represented, more than rot, worms, oblivion, and hollow eyes, like the promises and ideals of those who, in attempting to subrogate the delusions of order and control, fall into the condemnation of those who, by justified or imposed means, bend and subjugate the interest of true individual freedom. Moreover, whose principal consideration lies in the very exaltation of the freedom in which each being wishes to live, taking into account their forms and means of thinking and subsisting. It is for this reason that there should exist neither religious nor moral impediments. Yet all this had already been said and said again by the philosophers, who in their watchful detachment found calm not in seeing their prophecies fulfilled, but in knowing that from it the people of Rome might at least hear, though not yet understand. When silence returned among all those present and some not, only a single document remained intact upon the table. Lucius lifted it with hands that now bled from the tips of his fingers. Now, a single sentence throbbed upon the page, vivified by the spirit that, after the release from impurification, propels itself in the combustion of its own ashes, with which it was written, in an ink that still seemed fresh, owing to its long and, at the same time, brief and ephemeral existence. Forgive them, for they know exactly what they're doing. What had been mentioned before was not signed with a name, but with a symbol that made even the bravest step back, for it was one of the worst sins conceived by man and, paradoxically, one of the most usurped in the name of God. A sin that reaches back to antiquity itself, that of the man who allows himself to be ruled by wrath, greed, and ambition, a faithful reflection both of corruption and of perfect and mysterious creation. It was the so-called mark of Cain. The mark of murderers. The mark of murderers was not a visible sign, but one more tally, pending and silent, that grew both in life and in reincarnation. It was the mark of those who, through idolatry, chose to listen to the false idol of wrath rather than to the great God of love, always slow to punish and abundant in patience. That gift, that sacred boundary, was transgressed without miserliness or shame. Without doubt, Rome chose to raise itself as the supreme judge of all religious and moral authority. In the name of order, it consecrated blood. In the name of faith, it blessed violence. It was not God who demanded such sacrifices, but a human wrath raised to divinity, more convenient than mercy. Thus justice was confused with vengeance and became faithful doctrine. The tally continued to advance, invisible yet inexorable. Each choice made from fury rather than from clemency drew Rome farther from divine judgment, and slowly brought it closer to its own condemnation, which, rather than instilling fear, first pronounced the initial decree already rendered as a sentence without absolution. Answer and condemnation. Rome would never be the same again, without its paladin or its hierophant. The rejection of the people. The imposing St. Peter's Square seethed like a cauldron at red heat. The startled crowd that had not been executed was now obstinate in seeking answers to soothe its impotence, disillusionment, and violence, that same multitude which, only hours before, had cheered the new pope as a sign of a new order of ideas, conviction, and faith, now waited without remedy in unrest, madness, and tension. Meanwhile, those bodies degraded into human and divine oblivion pressed against the walls of the sumptuous papal basilica, their faces illuminated by the blood that oozed from the stones, and others reached toward the wretches who, through complicity or chance, lay there with torn garments and an innocuous heaviness that overcame their last remnant of sanity. In just yet terrible consequence, the words engraved upon the walls shone with a sickly radiance, as if written in phosphorescent pus that would not cease to flow in a torrent of malice, truth, and redemption. Blasphemy, cried an old man in a friar's habit, pointing with a trembling finger at the confessions that stained the facade adorned with the most exquisite medieval architecture, now sullied by the very weight of the sins it had carried and borne in silence like an eternal torture of existence. Then his voice broke when he recognized his own name on a list of priests who had sold false indulgences to their flock. A child no older than 8 forced his way between the legs of the adults, yet his eye seemed to gleam with an almost perverse or Machiavellian curiosity. "Father, what does it say there?" he asked, pointing to a passage where the blood formed obscene images of cardinals and nuns indulging in every pleasure granted to humanity. His reaction was immediate. The man struck him hard across the face, the slap echoing throughout the square. "Do not look, child. It is the work of the devil." But it was too late. The truth, once seen, could not be unseen, just as one who perceives and understands his error makes amends in honor of wisdom. The first stone came without warning. A rock the size of a fist struck the chest of a monk who was trying to wipe away the inscriptions with his old cloak. The man coughed, spitting out 3 teeth and a white worm that writhed across the marble before forming the word sinner. "Burn the liars," howled a woman whose face was covered in sores. In her arms she carried a baby whose black eyes reflected the flames that were beginning to rise in the square. In a spectacle of macabre lights and reflections, the basilica's stained glass windows mirrored the chaos which, far from ending, was being stoked by the popular outcry, multiplying it into 1,000 shards of color with which pandemonium and anarchy clothed themselves. In each of those fragments, Lucius appeared watching from different angles, his white tunic untouched by filth, his bare feet resting upon stones that turned black at his touch. Inside the Vatican, Borgia stepped out onto a secondary balcony. "People of Rome," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar. It was then that a tile thrown from below struck his forehead, and the blood that gushed forth inadvertently formed the very same symbol that Lucius had signed. Then the cardinal touched the wound, looked at his blooded fingers, and understood. "No," he murmured, stepping back into the shadows. "It's not possible." In the square, the mob had begun hurling stones at their own neighbors and acquaintances. Even a prostitute known as Magdalene screamed as her dress was torn away, revealing marks of flagellation identical to Lucius's stigmata, preserved as an eternal scourge of redemption. "Witch!" accused a merchant who had paid for her services just hours before. The woman did not defend herself. She only raised her arms, displaying the wounds that now bled in synchrony with those oozing from the walls of the basilica, a spectacle that, far from being ridiculous, was atrocious, a spectacle that had escaped neither gossip, whispers, nor even prophecy. "He has marked us all," she announced in a clear voice. "Look at your own hands." The crowd paused. One by one, they began to examine their palms. There, etched in fine red lines, appeared numbers, the count of sins each had committed, not according to morality, but according to the transgressions of the true sacred scriptures, which, for reasons of religion and creed, could not be spoken aloud. As a consequence of ill tongues and bad omens, a horrible silence fell over the square. Until the child who had been slapped minutes before burst into laughter. "Look, father!" he shouted, showing his small blood-stained hands. "You have many more than I do." The poor man looked at his palms. The number 6666 throbbed beneath his skin like a fresh wound. At that moment, the first relentless lightning bolt fell from a clear sky, incinerating the friar where he stood. Likewise, his body was reduced to ashes, which formed one final word before scattering. "Hypocrite!" The crowd went mad. Lucius, watching in bewilderment from the highest window of the Vatican, let a tear fall, which, upon hitting the ground, transformed into a beautiful black rose. "Forgive them," he whispered, "for they chose this over their salvation." It is a salvation that demands consciousness, that calls for responsibility over the acts committed and the omissions allowed. It does not descend from heaven as unmerited grace, but is forged in conflict, in the recognition of error, and in direct confrontation with guilt. Thus, worship is not blind submission, but a cruel mirror in which the believer is forced to acknowledge both his own fragility and his capacity for destruction. In that passage, the purge does not seek to annihilate, but to strip away. It tears off masks, dissolves comfortable narratives, and exposes the human being to the vastness of the infinite that he helped create and that, at the same time, judges him. Only then, when faith ceases to be a refuge and becomes a conscious burden, does salvation gain meaning, not as escape, but as a painful and necessary transformation. And somewhere beneath the city, the bones of the deceased popes began to laugh, sing, and dance, without prelude to the treacherous end that awaited them, for what they were witnessing was nothing other than the effect of the decisions and actions that all had unleashed. It is for this reason that where a society is ruled by bandits as leaders, sold to the highest bidder, whose regimes of terror feed on the nectar of control, narrative, and power. Thus, let it be an occasion of celebration for all who have lost faith and hope. Let the cruel certainty of condemnation always balance their sorrowful unrest. Long live the wretched in this macabre dance, striving to rise above fate and death itself, an appointment one evades, yet from which one cannot escape. Chapter 15, The Judgment of God. Luke 12 verses 2-3. For there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, nor hidden that will not be made known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms will be proclaimed on the rooftops. The public confessions. In natural repugnance and merciless rigor, the air in the Sistine Chapel thickened with each breath, heavy with the sweetish scent of melted wax and the metallic stench of old blood resting in the sacred. Lucius I did not occupy the papal throne that, by right or implication, he ought to assume. He had only seated himself upon the steps of the altar, his back resting against the fresco of the Last Judgment, as if refusing to be part of it and the great divine theatre prepared for all humanity. Gently and warily, the candlelight danced across his face, accentuating the deep shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, prayers unanswered to the clamoring, and promises made to his holy Redeemer. Your Holiness, this is a profanation. Cardinal Orsini stepped forward, his footsteps echoing across the marble. The sleeves of his cassock concealed hands that had aged decades in the past few days, the skin now translucent like old parchment. Lucius lifted his gaze. Thus it was that his eyes, completely black since the coronation, reflected the flames of the candles and the crosses in reverse. Profanation, Orsini. His voice was soft, almost paternal. Or purification? Without warning, a crash shook the chapel. The main doors slammed shut, sealing with a final sound that echoed like the closing of a tomb's gate for the last time, for such an event should never again be witnessed through the eyes of a wretched mortal. From the fresco above their heads, the figures painted by Michelangelo began to move. Between madness and misfortune, the damned seemed to writhe in hell, caught in a compulsive, intermediate yet eternal malediction. Then they extended their hands toward those present, while the saints in heaven cast furtive glances at the captives, debased and ashamed of their crimes and atrocities. Today, Lucius rose, his white tunic unmoving, though the air in the chapel swirled violently in an imperceptible melody. God will judge his church. But not as you expect. Then he extended a hand toward the first priest in the line, Father Moretti, a man of robust build and easy smile who had managed the funds of 3 dioceses. Confess. The command was not an invitation. It was an almost divine mandate, pronounced with the authority of one who had seen the face of God and had not knelt. Old Moretti fell to his knees as if his tendons had been severed, tendons that had only been there as ornament. His mouth opened in a mute scream before the words began to pour from his thin lips, not in his usual cultivated baritone, but in the high-pitched shrieks of the orphans whose inheritances he had stolen in their childhood, and with them, part of their history. In the name of Christ, stop! Bishop Valenti tried to intervene, but when he opened his own mouth to protest, he coldly confessed how he had sold the sacred oils to buy sexual favors. His words came out in tainted Latin, each syllable causing the veins in his neck to swell like worms beneath the skin, and his face revealed weakness, shame, and terror. It was then that the chaos surrounding them infiltrated even the only place where cardinals, clergy, and episcopal agents still believed they could find some measure of calm and security, though with a shared anguish in the face of disquiet, anarchy, and an ignominy without creed, limits, or form. Like rats fleeing imminent danger, the priests who tried to escape in terror discovered that the side doors no longer led to freedom. Instead, each threshold opened onto the stages of their own sins, the confessional where they had abused children, the secret chamber where they falsified relics, the deathbed on which they had asphyxiated wealthy benefactors to inherit their properties and fortunes. "It's the devil!" shouted a young monk, gouging out his eyes when he saw his own hands marked with red numbers that tallied every sin he had committed. Lucius watched, like a lethal champion lying in wait, the pandemonium and human waste regurgitated before him. He no longer manifested with arrogance, but with a calm far more intimidating than serene. Any tempestuous outburst of his indomitable youth and power was absent, despite that being what one might expect from someone invested as the sacred chosen. At his feet, a silver bowl collected the tears now flowing from his stigmata, not blood, but almost the same silvery liquid that Isadora had wept in her cell of torture, spiritual experimentation, and human rectification. It is not the devil, he corrected as the bowl filled to the brim. It is your own soul reflected in the mirror of God. In the center of the chapel, Cardinal Borgia writhed on the floor as a prelude to the unnameable. His silk garments were consumed by invisible flames that revealed what lay beneath. His torso was covered with tiny mouths, each murmuring a different confession, but with the same vocation, not toward veneration, but toward the condemnation of his culpable worldliness. "Have mercy," pleaded one mouth. "Kill me," pleaded another. "You also have blood on your hands, Lucius," accused a third. The so-called, but certainly deliberate, heretic pope did not deny the charge. He rose, and for the first time, all saw what his indefinite shadow had been hiding. He no longer retained a human form, but writhed like a creature of tentacles and eyes, absorbing every confession, every sin, every exposed lie. "Yes," admitted Lucius as Borgia's mouths fell silent in terror. "But I never claimed to be a saint." With a gesture, he overturned the bowl of silvery tears. Without a sound, yet equally beyond any notion of normalcy, the liquid did not fall to the floor, but rose and unfolded into a suspended river, a living current that snaked through the air and joined, throat by throat, with everyone present in the hall. Then, without will or resistance, they were forced to sing in perfect Enochian. "We absolve ourselves of nothing. Let us condemn ourselves to everything." Outside, in the streets of Rome, the battered and wounded citizens who had gathered to protest the depravity fell to their knees as the priest's confessions erupted simultaneously from every statue in the city. Imparting judgment, the marbles of the saints opened their mouths to vomit truths buried for centuries, while from their eyes flowed blood that, upon touching the ground, transformed into worms of living letters. They did not reflect the precepts of those who had fallen into the great night of confusion, yet these creatures writhed, forming words of filth, but also of reverence. Soon they began to seize the panic and collective terror of those still standing, clinging to the fevered conviction of their own madness, turning the city into a sumptuous and macabre grotesque where faith could no longer hide behind stone nor behind the blood that flowed. Sister Agatha, an elderly nun who had spent 50 years caring for orphans, tried to flee the torrent of revelations and depravity. But as she passed in front of the fountain of tears, the waters turned red and revealed her younger reflection, strangling a newborn in a convent in Florence. "It was for their own good," lied the nun, but the fountain repeated her words in the voice of the mother who had died in childbirth. At that moment, the first lightning struck the basilica. Not from the sky, but from the depths of the earth, splitting Michelangelo's dome in two with a crash that shook the foundations of all Rome and its surroundings. From the endless abyss, created through subtlety, figures began to emerge dressed in the tattered robes of the earliest popes, their bones visible beneath almost rotten flesh, yet with eyes burning with a masterful intelligence, both supernatural and ominous. Without indifference, yet with great rejoicing, Lucius received them with open arms, like a child welcoming his beloved yet unwelcome parents. "Welcome to the final judgment," he whispered, now with a sad smile. "Yours." Beyond all comprehension, alongside those popes who had risen to witness the final judgment, all manner of monstrosities and creatures of evil gradually seized everything that was there. Only a few could survive the human stampede of feet running to save the last remnants of what remained after hope, and that was the very last thing God had allowed up to that moment for those souls fading away amid terror and confusion. As the deceased pontiffs advanced upon the terrified cardinals, the walls of the chapel began to bleed the lost text of the final judgment, and this time, there would be no forgiveness for Rome. The indifference of Rome. The sun languished in its fateful awakening, like a devoted witness collapsing over Rome, when Lucius emerged from the Sistine Chapel. His white tunic, now stained with silver and rust, billowed behind him like the banner of an invisible army that had swept away everything in its path, not an army made of factions and warlords, but one subject to the law and the fortune of the most wretched. "Miracle! Miracle!" shouted a street vendor by the steps of the square. "Authentic relics of the heretic pope. Silvery tears in crystal vials." A group of enraged pilgrims pressed around the supposed charlatan. Their hands, eager and prone to deception, raised coins in exchange for vials that contained nothing more than water from the Tiber mixed with mercury, filth, and a little wine. Lucius watched the scene with an expression that was neither a smile nor a gesture of pain, but something in between, something barely human. "Do you see it?" whispered Metatron, appearing at his side like a ghost among the shadows. "Not even your truths can change his nature." A roar of laughter made them glance at one another. In the central fountain, 3 young priests with ruddy faces were tossing coins into the water, betting on who could sink a consecrated host first, amid mockery and feigned fervor. "I'll bet 5 ducats on mine," joked the tallest, his gold crucifix swinging like a pendulum of mockery. Then Lucius extended a hand toward the fountain. The waters clouded instantly, revealing reflections that were not mere reflections, but images of those same priests stealing alms, violating vows, and profaning sacraments. The crowd held its breath for a moment, and then erupted into loud, intrusive laughter. "Good trick, Your Holiness!" shouted a merchant from his stall of rotten fruit. "What else can the great necromancer do?" Then, a disheveled woman pushed her way through the crowd, dragging along a scrawny, ugly, ragged child. "Perform a real miracle," she demanded, pushing the little boy forward. "My son is sick. Or is it that your God only punishes and does not heal?" With hardly a gesture, Lucius looked at the boy. It was then that he saw the fever in his eyes and the suffering in his frail flesh, the phthisis in his breathing, a certain sign of tuberculosis, yet he also saw something beyond the terribly evident, the seeds of the same indifference that was corroding Rome, as it persecuted its own ignorance and fearful madness. He extended his hand, but the mother recoiled sharply, leaving some rags suspended in the air. "No," she spat. "I don't want your black magic. I want a true miracle. Like those from before Moses." The heretic pope let his arm fall slowly. Something in his black eyes cracked, though his voice remained steady and fully resonant. "The miracles you seek are the ones that have kept you blind." His words fell like stones into a dry pond of logs and sand. Bodies healed so that souls remained sick. An uncomfortable silence followed his words, perfectly in time with his profane choir. Then, as if someone had given a signal, as an innate instinct of that decimated yet no less furious and enraged crowd faced with the impotence imposed by their own moral judgments and consequent actions, the entire square erupted into a suddenly violent movement, leaving fewer and fewer people standing. Even so, the vendor of false relics resumed his hawking. The priests continued their rogue, blasphemous, and shameless game. The mother dragged her ugly son toward another sanctuary, where surely another charlatan, of the kind that abound, would sell her yet another stubborn lie. Only one figure remained still before the ever-suffering chaos and cruel dominion, an old man seated on the steps of the basilica, peeling an apple with a rusted knife that made him forget, for a moment, the vile destruction and decay. He had only experienced a brief surge of his ferocity. Then, his clear eyes followed Lucius with a perplexed and almost unchanging curiosity. "You don't understand, do you?" The old man bit into the fruit with a dry crunch. "Rome does not fear your truths because Rome already knows them. She embraces them every night in her beds, chews them with her rancid bread, drinks them with her sour wine." Fully aware of it, Lucius studied the old man. He did not smell of incense or sin, but of ink and old paper. "Are you a scribe?" "I was an archivist of the Vatican." A nearly toothless smile appeared immediately. "For 40 years I copied your lies onto fine parchment. No one reads more than the words they wish to read, Your Holiness." Like an ill-omened crow, a scream made them look at one another. In the fountain, one of the young priests now writhed on the ground, his mouth full of worms forming words in vulgar Latin. The crowd, far from horrified, pressed around as if witnessing a street performance that had simply become scenery and daily bread, paraphernalia, amusement, and entertainment for a people seeking not only their dignity, but something they could call sanity. Humor was not lacking, adorning such a mortal and putrid place, And the worst part was that, while evil seized everything, the poor people neither realized it nor reacted, trapped in numbing stupefaction and the reigning chaos. "More! More!" they shouted, tossing coins into the comfort of the dying man. In barely the blink of an eye, Lucius felt a hand on his arm. It was the monk Metatron, his bandages now completely soaked with that dark liquid that never ceased to ooze, nor did his time of condemnation on earth grant him respite. "Do you see it now?" whispered the monk in a hoarse voice. "There is no sin that has not been transformed into understanding, nor sinner who has not become a convert. There is no truth they have not domesticated, nor impurity that has not been atoned for in the experience of a soul." The so-called heretic pope looked toward the basilica. High above, the statues of the saints wept blood that, upon falling, turned into silver coins, immediately contested by the populace as if that insidious treasure held a symbolic value for which they should fight to the death in a trivial battle, oblivious to the guiding principle by which God orders and gives purpose to the life of every living being on earth. "Then Rome will die laughing," concluded Lucius, his voice carrying a sorrow for what was to come. "And no one, not even God, will be able to save her from herself." Then the elderly archivist tossed the core of his apple into the fountain, where it floated among the coins like a human heart ripped from a chest. "That is the truth no book records, Your Holiness." He chewed the last portion of his fruit. "The people do not want to be saved. They want spectacle. The people want spectacle because they need to feel some kind of satisfaction amid their profound emptiness of meaning and absence of redemption, which leads to vain forms of entertainment as a substitute for what is truly essential." Was it money? Was it power? Perhaps. But condemnation and redemption come from the very challenge that evil, embodied in what we call Satan, presents to us daily, as judge, warrior, and trainer. And so, beneath a sky that was no longer blue nor black, but the color of indifference, staining not only the firmament but also the streets of the great and unconquerable city in its final throes, Lucius I finally understood his pact-bound failure, one whose full consequences he had yet to discern. He was neither prophet nor antichrist. Only another actor in a play whose spectators had ceased to believe in the script that gave meaning to their lives, their reason, and their purpose.